They say the dust of the plains remembers everything. It holds the memory of buffalo thunder and the hush of a sky so wide it could swallow a man's soul whole. It remembers the blood that seasons the soil and the tears that turn to salt on a wind that never stops blowing. And it remembers the strangers, the ones who drift in like tumbleweeds, carrying a past as heavy and as silent as the stones in their pockets. Elias was such a man. He arrived in the town of Redemption, a name too hopeful for the cracked earth and sun-bleached wood that comprised it, with nothing but a lame horse and a cart with a splintered wheel. The man himself looked much like his rig, broken in a fundamental way, yet still moving forward under some grim, internal obligation. His face was a map of hard miles and harder fights, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow and disappearing into a hairline the color of iron filings. His eyes, the shade of a stormy sky, saw everything and revealed nothing. He didn't speak more than was necessary, his voice a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. He asked for the blacksmith, and the stable boy, a youth with more freckles than teeth, just pointed a lazy finger down the only street. "Ain't no Smith. Older man Hemlock passed a winter ago. But his daughter, she knows the fire, her name was Ilara." He found her not in a proper smithy, but in a lean-to beside a weary-looking cottage, the air shimmering with the heat of a small, hand-cranked forge. She was not what he expected. There was a fineness to her bones that seemed ill-suited for the hammer she wielded, yet she moved with a practiced economy, her arms corded with a wiry strength that spoke of unending labor. Soot smudged her cheekbone like a warrior's paint, and her hair, the color of sun-cured wheat, was ruthlessly tied back. She didn't look up when his shadow fell over her anvil. She felt it, the way an animal feels the presence of a predator. Her shoulders tightened. "What is it?" Her voice was not unkind, but it was edged with a defensiveness that was as much a tool of her trade as the tongs in her hand. "My wheel," Elias said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He gestured back toward the street. It split. She finally looked at him then, her gaze sweeping over him once, quick and assessing. She saw the gun holstered low on his hip, the set of his jaw, the profound weariness in his posture that he could not conceal. She saw danger, but she also saw a man at the end of a long, bitter road. She wiped her palms on her leather apron, a gesture of habit, a wiping away of the world's grime. "Bring it," he did. He unhitched the heavy wooden wheel and rolled it to her lean-to, his movement slow and deliberate, pained. A limp, he'd concealed it well, but the effort of the wheel exposed it. Ilara noticed but said nothing. To remark on a man's weakness in this land was to issue a challenge. She ran her fingers over the splintered wood, her touch both clinical and respectful. "The hub is cracked. I can brace it. But it won't be new, it just needs to hold," he said. He watched her work. Her hands, though stained and calloused, were deft. She heated the iron brace in the glowing coals, her face illuminated by the pulsing heart of the fire. The rhythmic clang of her hammer on hot metal was the only sound between them, a language of pure function. He thought of other sounds, of gunfire and screams, and pushed them down deep into the place where he kept the rest of his ghosts. When she was done, the iron brace was cinched tight around the hub, a dark scar of a repair. The wheel was whole again, if not unblemished. "How much?" he asked, reaching into his coat. She named a price, a fair one, but he could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear that he would argue it down. He pulled out a small leather pouch and counted out coins into his palm. He gave her double what she'd asked. Her head snapped up, pride and suspicion warring in her expression. "That's too much, it's a good repair," he stated, his voice leaving no room for argument. He turned and rolled the wheel back to his cart, every step a measure of his control over the pain in his leg. He fixed it in place, his back to her, feeling her eyes on him the entire time. He should have left. He should have climbed onto his cart and urged his tired horse onward, into the endless expanse of nothing that was his destination. But he did not. A strange current held him there. It was the same stubborn resilience he saw in her that he once believed he possessed. As the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of rust and rose, he watched her pack her tools. She moved with an air of finality, her work for the day done. She did not go into the cottage by the forge. Instead, she started walking, her path leading away from the town, out into the scrubland where the earth grew poorer and the houses, what few there were, seemed to crouch lower to the ground, as if hiding from the sky. He did not know why he followed. It was not a conscious decision. His body simply moved, a silent shadow trailing a respectable distance behind her, his footsteps making no sound in the thick dust. He was a hunter by nature, and his instincts were stirred by a mystery he could not name. The walk was long, farther than he'd thought. He saw her destination cresting a low rise, a small, ramshackle homestead that looked as if it were held together by sheer willpower. The roof sagged, the porch tilted, and the fence was a ragged line of broken teeth. It was a place on the very edge of surrender. But it was not surrendered. As he drew closer, hiding behind a cluster of mesquite, he heard it. A sound so unexpected in that desolate landscape that it struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was singing. A voice, clear and soft, weaving a simple melody through the twilight air. It was Ilara's voice. He crept closer, his heart a tight, unfamiliar knot in his chest. Through a grimy windowpane, he saw the source of the song. Ilara was sitting on the floor in the center of a bare room, lit by a single flickering candle. And around her, like small planets orbiting a gentle sun, were 5 children. They were barefoot, their clothes patched and thin, but their faces were turned up to her, their eyes wide and captivated. She was singing a lullaby, a song of lost streams and hidden meadows, a promise of a world that did not exist here. As she sang, she moved among them, touching a shoulder, stroking a head of tangled hair, her hands that had been so strong and capable with the hammer now impossibly gentle. One of the children, a tiny girl with eyes as dark as his own, leaned her head against Ilara's knee, and Ilara's hand came to rest on her back, a silent shield against the vast, encroaching dark. Elias stood frozen in the cool night air, the hunter completely disarmed. He had followed a woman he'd paid to fix his cart. But he had found a fortress, built not of wood and stone, but of courage and song. He looked at the 5 barefoot children, at the fierce, tender woman who was their entire world, and the cold, dead thing inside his chest felt a flicker. It was a warmth so faint it was almost pain. The dust of the plains remembered everything, and in that moment, Elias knew this place, this woman, this song, would be a memory he could never outrun. For 3 days, Elias did not leave. He did not approach the house again, nor did he return to the town. He made a cold, smokeless camp in a shallow ravine a quarter-mile from Ilara's homestead, a place where he could see without being easily seen. It was the kind of camp a man on the run would make, a habit from a life he was trying to bury. But he was not running anymore. He was watching. He was waiting, though for what, he could not say. On the first morning, he saw her lead the children out to a small, dusty patch of ground behind the house. It was a garden, or the ghost of one. They carried buckets of water from a deep, stone-lined well, their small forms struggling with the weight. He watched them work for an hour before the sun grew too fierce. That afternoon, while they were inside, he walked the perimeter of her property. The fence was, as he had suspected, rotten. A strong wind could take it. He spent the rest of the day gathering fallen timber from a nearby copse of withered trees, using his belt axe to limb and cut the wood into posts. He worked with a silent, relentless efficiency, his body remembering the rhythms of labor, the ache in his muscles a welcome distraction from the ache in his soul. He left the stack of posts near the broken section of fence and retreated to his camp before dusk. The next day, he watched as one of the older boys discovered the pile of wood. The boy stood over it, bewildered, then ran inside. A moment later, Ilara appeared in the doorway. She scanned the horizon, her body tense, a rifle held loosely in one hand. Her eye swept over his hiding place, but he remained perfectly still, a part of the landscape. She saw nothing. He saw the conflict in her stance, the fear of a stranger's intentions, and the stark reality of her need. The wood was a gift she could not afford to refuse. She did not touch it. Not that day. Instead, she put the children to work on other chores, her eyes straying often to the silent offering. That night, Elias took his rifle and went hunting. The land was sparse, but not barren. He was patient. Just before dawn, he brought down a lean buck. He dressed it quickly, his knife moving with practiced skill, and carried the meat back. He left it hanging from a low branch of the single sturdy tree near her well, shrouded in cheesecloth to keep the flies away. He was back in his ravine before the first rooster crowed. This time, she could not ignore it. The meat was a necessity, a reprieve from the cornmeal and dried beans he imagined was their staple. He watched as she approached the offering, the rifle still in her hand. She circled it, her caution a palpable thing. She looked for tracks, for some sign of the person responsible. He had been careful, leaving none. Finally, with a deep sigh that seemed to carry the weight of her entire world, she lowered the rifle and cut down a portion of the meat. That evening, for the first time, a thin tendril of smoke rose from the chimney of her house. The smell of roasting venison drifted on the air, a scent of small celebration. Later, as darkness settled deep and complete, she walked out from the house. She carried a bowl, covered with a cloth. She walked to the spot where the fence posts lay and set the bowl down on top of the pile. Then she turned and walked back to her home without a backward glance. It was a treaty. A silent negotiation concluded without a single word. Elias waited a long hour before he approached. The bowl contained a thick venison stew, rich with root vegetables from her meager garden. It was still warm. He sat with his back against the woodpile and ate, the simple, honest food a balm to a hunger that went deeper than his belly. It was the first meal cooked by another's hand that he had eaten in over 2 years. He had forgotten what it felt like. The next morning, he began to work on the fence. He did not need to hide anymore. The treaty was in effect. He dug post holes in the hard, unforgiving earth, his bad leg protesting with a dull, throbbing rhythm. He worked steadily, his silence as profound as the silence of the plains around them. The children came out to watch, gathering at a safe distance. They were whispers and wide eyes. The oldest, a girl of about 10 named Anna, had her mother's serious expression. The youngest, a boy of 4 called Samuel, clutched a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Elias ignored them, not out of unkindness, but because he did not know what to do with the innocent weight of their attention. Samuel, bolder than the rest, took a few tentative steps forward. He stopped a few feet from Elias and held out the bird. "Made it," he whispered, his voice small. Elias stopped his digging. He looked from the boy's earnest face to the small object in his hand. He knelt, the movement stiff and painful, and looked at the bird. It was rough, but it had the unmistakable shape of a soaring hawk. He reached out, his large, scarred hand dwarfing the boy's, and gently touched the bird's wooden wing with one finger. He looked at Samuel and gave a single, slow nod. A flicker of a smile, so small it was almost not there, touched the boy's lips. He scurried back to the safety of his siblings. Ilara watched from the porch, her hands wrapped in her apron. She had seen the exchange. She had seen the way his eyes had softened for a barest second, a crack in the stone facade. He did not want her thanks, she understood that. He wanted nothing, it seemed. And that was the most terrifying and mystifying thing of all. He was a man who acted without demanding payment, a concept so foreign in her world that she had no name for it. That evening, she brought his meal to him herself. She set the bowl on a crate near where he worked. He stopped, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his forearm. Their eyes met. "The fence is good," she said, her voice quiet. "It will hold," he replied. It was the longest conversation they'd had. She lingered for a moment, as if wanting to say more, to ask the question that hung in the air between them like a ghost, "Who are you?" But she did not. The silence was its own kind of language, and they were both becoming fluent. She turned and went back to the house, to the 5 small lives that depended on her. Elias watched her go, then sat down to eat his stew. The sun was setting, and the new posts of the fence stood like sentinels in the fading light. He was mending more than just a fence. He was mending the broken perimeter of a life, and he was beginning to suspect that it might also be his own. The peace, fragile as a spider's web, lasted for a month. It was a time of quiet routine, of unspoken understanding. Elias finished the fence, his hands raw but the boundary secure. He repaired the sagging porch roof, his hammer blows a steady heartbeat in the day. He taught the oldest boy, David, how to set snares, his instruction spare and direct, conveyed more through gesture than words. He never crossed the threshold of the house, yet his presence became woven into the fabric of their lives. He was the silent guardian, the provider in the distance. The children no longer feared him. They would leave him small treasures, a smooth river stone, a bird's feather, a misshapen carrot pulled from the garden, at the edge of his campsite. He would acknowledge them with a nod, his gaze lingering on them with a troubled tenderness that Elara witnessed from her window. She saw the pain in his eyes when he looked at them, a deep, ancient sorrow. She began to leave a lantern out for him, its small flame a beacon against the immense darkness of the plains. It was her way of saying, "I see you." He, in turn, began to leave his day's work, a brace of rabbits, a pile of chopped firewood, closer to the house, a slow, cautious drawing near. They lived on either side of an invisible line, two solitary souls finding a strange equilibrium. Then, the wind changed. It began as a subtle shift, a colder edge to the evening breeze, a restlessness in the cattle lowing from a distant ranch. The sky took on a bruised, yellow-grey tinge at the horizon. It was the kind of weather that foretold more than just a storm. It was an omen. Elias felt it first. A prickling on his skin, a familiar tension coiling in his gut. It was the feeling of being watched, the hunter's instinct that he was now the hunted. He started carrying his rifle with him everywhere, his hand rarely straying from the worn stock. His silence, once peaceful, became heavy, fraught with a new vigilance. Elara felt it too. She saw the change in him, the way his gaze constantly swept the horizon, the way he would freeze, listening to a sound she could not hear. The quiet comfort of his presence was replaced by a shared anxiety. The unspoken question, "Who are you?" now had a terrifying corollary, "What is coming for you?" The answer arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. 3 riders, materializing out of the heat haze on the plains. They were not drifters or cowboys. They rode with a purpose, their horses sleek and black, their clothes dark and well-made. They moved with the synchronized menace of a wolf pack. Elias saw them from the ridge where he was scouting. A cold dread, sharp and metallic, flooded his mouth. He knew the man in the lead. He knew the cruel, confident set of his shoulders, the expensive cut of his coat. Silas Kane. A ghost from the life he had burned to the ground. He sprinted back towards the homestead, his limp a savage fire in his leg. He had to warn her. But he was too late. By the time he reached the cover of the ravine overlooking the house, Kane and his men were already dismounting by the new fence. Elias slid into the dirt, his rifle pressed to his shoulder, the house and its inhabitants caught perfectly in his sights. He was 100 yards away. Too far for a sure shot at 3 men, but close enough to watch the nightmare unfold. Silas Kane moved with an easy, predatory grace. He ran a gloved hand over the top of one of the new fence posts, a slow, appraising gesture. "Good work," he said, his voice carrying on the still air. He smiled, a flash of white teeth that held no warmth. Elara came out onto the porch. She had the rifle. She did not raise it, but held it across her body, a barrier. The children were huddled behind her, peeking around her skirts like frightened chicks. "State your business," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor he could see in her hands. Kane's smile widened. He removed his hat, a gesture of mock politeness. "Forgive the intrusion, My name is Silas Kane. We're searching for a former associate. A man of particular talents." Answers to the name Elias, he looked directly at her, his eyes cold and intelligent. "Tall man. Quiet. Carries himself like he's owed a debt by God himself. Sound familiar?" Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. He could end it. One shot. But Kane's men were positioned carefully, their hands hovering near their guns. If he fired, Elara and the children would be caught in the crossfire. His past was now standing on her porch, threatening to devour the small sanctuary they had built. Elara's face was a pale, determined mask. Never heard of him. Now get off my land. Her bravery was a stunning, terrible thing to behold. Cain chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. A shame. I had hoped you would be more cooperative. We have it on good authority he passed through this area. A man like that, he leaves a mark. Mended things, perhaps. A broken wheel. A broken fence. He gestured again to the post. His eyes flickered over the children, a chilling, calculating gaze. A man like him, he has a weakness for strays. It was his undoing before the threat was clear, hanging in the air like poison. He was not just asking about Elias, he was telling Elara what he would do to her and the children to draw him out. We'll be in town, Cain said, placing his hat back on his head. At the saloon. Should you happen to remember anything? We'll be back tomorrow. I do hope your memory improves by then. He mounted his horse, gave a final, chilling smile, and rode away, his men falling in behind him. They left a cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence. Elara stood on the porch for a long time, the rifle clutched in her white-knuckled hands, until the riders were just specks on the horizon. The children began to cry, soft, terrified sounds. Elias rose from the dirt, his body shaking with a fury so cold it felt like ice in his veins. He walked out of the ravine and toward the house, his cover blown, the treaty shattered. He stepped onto the porch. This was the first time he had done so. He looked at Elara, at her fierce, frightened face. His own was carved from stone. You have to go, he said, his voice a rasp, raw with guilt and rage. Take the children. Head east. Don't stop. She looked up at him, her eyes blazing. The fear was still there, but it was being consumed by a defiant anger. No, Elara, he said her name for the first time, the sound of it a plea. He will not stop. He will hurt you to get to me. This is my home, she said, her voice trembling but unbroken. We have nowhere else to go. She looked past him, at the fence he had built, at the land that had nearly broken her but had not succeeded. Then she looked back at him. And you, she added, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You have nowhere else to go either. In that moment, the line between them vanished. His past was now their present. His fight was now their fight. He was no longer the silent guardian in the distance. He was a man standing on a porch with a woman and her 5 children, with the full weight of his sins about to come crashing down upon them all. The air grew thick with the coming violence. The setting sun cast long, distorted shadows that clawed at the walls of the small house. Inside, the silence was a living thing, broken only by the quiet, fearful breathing of the children, who were huddled together on a pallet in the corner of the main room. Elara was cleaning the rifle, her movements methodical and precise, a way to channel the terror into a useful task. Elias stood by the window, a sentinel staring out into the encroaching twilight. The man who had been a weary drifter was gone. In his place stood the man Silas Cain was hunting, focused, dangerous, and steeped in a grim understanding of what was to come. He was charting the terrain in his mind, mapping every rock, every ditch, every shadow that could serve as cover or concealment. He'll come at dusk, Elias said, his voice low and certain. He likes the theatrics of it. And the long light gives him an advantage. Elara didn't look up from her work. How many more will he bring? He won't bring more. He's arrogant. He thinks his 2 men are enough for 1 woman and a cripple. He turned from the window, his face etched with a pain that had nothing to do with his leg. I should have left the day I arrived. He would have found you anyway, she said, her voice soft but firm. She finally looked at him, her gaze direct. And we would have been alone when he came asking his questions. The simple truth of her words settled between them. His presence had brought the danger, but his absence would have left them defenseless against it. He walked over to the small wooden table where she sat today. He laid his own pistol on the worn wood, checking the action with an expert's touch. I rode with him for 3 years, he said, the confession costing him more than any coin he had ever spent. He wasn't a captain. He was a leader. We weren't soldiers. We took what we wanted. Land, gold, anything that wasn't nailed down. We called it acquisition, he called it building an empire. He paused, his hand stilling on the cold metal of his gun. But the acquisition started to include people. Families who wouldn't sell their land. He stopped leaving witnesses. I was there when when a fire took a whole family. A man, his wife, 2 children, the ghosts he kept locked away were now in the room with them, their silent screams echoing in his memory. I told him I was done. I shot my way out of camp that night. Took a bullet in the leg for my trouble. He's been hunting me ever since. Not for revenge. For pride. He can't stand that one of his men walked away. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing so profound it was a physical presence. That is who I am, Ilara. She finished loading the rifle and stood up. She did not recoil from his confession. She did not look at him with judgment. She looked at him with a sad, knowing compassion. That is who you were, she said quietly. The man I know built a fence. He brought us food. He taught my son how to be gentle with a trap. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before they rested on his arm. Her touch was light, but it anchored him. That man is who you are now. A profound silence fell, a moment of fragile, desperate connection before the storm. He gave her a spare pistol. Stay inside. Keep the children in the back room, away from the windows. Bar the door. Do not open it unless you hear my voice. If they get past me, you know what you have to do. She nodded, her face pale but resolute. Be safe, Elias. He gave a short, grim nod and turned, melting out the back door and into the purple twilight. The world outside was hushed, expectant. The wind had died down. Even the insects were silent. It was the deep breath before the plunge. Elias moved with a swift, silent grace that belied his injury. He took up a position in the woodpile he had built, the stacked logs providing solid cover. From here, he could see the front of the house and the lane leading up to it. He laid his rifle on a log, took a deep breath, and became part of the shadows. An hour passed. Then another. The moon rose, a cold, silver coin in the black sky. Then, he heard it. The soft thud of hoofbeats on packed earth. 3 riders, just as he'd predicted. They approached without haste, their arrogance a tangible thing. Cain was in the lead, a silhouette of dark confidence. They stopped 20 yards from the house. Elias! Cain's voice cut through the stillness. I know you're in there. I can smell the cowardice on you. Come out and face me like a man, or I'll burn this little shack to the ground with your new family inside. Silence. Elias didn't move. Didn't breathe. Have it your way, Cain sneered. He gave a nod to one of his men. The man dismounted, carrying a torch he'd lit from a flint. He started walking toward the house. This was the moment. Elias centered the man's chest in his sights. He let out half a breath and squeezed the trigger. The rifle shot was a deafening crack that shattered the night. The man with the torch stumbled, a look of surprise on his face, before collapsing in a heap. The torch sputtered out in the dirt. Damn you! Cain roared, he and his remaining man diving for cover behind their horses. Gunfire erupted, bullets thudding into the woodpile around Elias, sending splinters flying. He ducked low, reloading with swift, practiced movements. Inside the house, Ilara had herded the terrified children into the small root cellar, its earthen walls the safest place. Then she took up her position at a small, shuttered window at the back of the house, the pistol Elias had given her heavy in her hand. The second man tried to circle around the side of the house, using the darkness as cover. But Elias had anticipated it. He had left a pile of loose tins near the corner. The man stumbled over them with a loud clatter. Elias fired again, not at the man, but at the ground in front of him. The bullet ricocheted, and the man screamed, clutching his leg. He was out of the fight. Now it was just him and Cain. It's always just you and me in the end, isn't it, Elias? Cain yelled, his voice laced with a bitter fury. He fired a volley toward the woodpile, giving himself cover to move. He was smart. He wasn't charging. He was flanking, moving toward the dark side of the house, toward the back. Toward Ilara. Elias's blood ran cold. He broke cover, running in a low crouch toward the corner of the house to intercept him. He saw Cain's shadow just as Cain saw his. They fired at the same time. A hot, searing pain tore through Elias's shoulder. He stumbled but didn't fall. His own shot had missed. Cain laughed, a harsh, triumphant sound. "You've gotten slow, old friend." He raised his pistol for the final shot. But at that moment, a gunshot exploded from the back of the house. It wasn't Elias's rifle. It was the sharp crack of a pistol. Ilara. She had fired from the window. The shot went wide, not meant to hit, but to distract. It was all Elias needed. Cain flinched, turning toward the sound for a fraction of a second. Elias launched himself forward, ignoring the fire in his shoulder, and slammed into Cain, driving him to the ground. The fight was no longer about guns. It was primal. Fists and fury in the dirt. They rolled and grappled, two sides of the same violent coin. "You had everything." Cain spat, landing a blow to Elias's ribs. "I gave you a kingdom." Elias drove his fist into Cain's jaw. "You built a kingdom on graves," he grunted, the words torn from his throat. He gained the upper hand, his desperation giving him strength. He pinned Cain beneath him, his hands closing around his throat. Cain's eyes bulged, his face purpling in the moonlight. For a moment, the old Elias, the killer, was there. He could end it. Squeeze the life from this man and bury his past for good. Then he saw her. Ilara was standing on the back porch, her face a pale oval in the darkness, the pistol still in her hand. He saw the fear in her eyes, but not for herself. For him. For what he was about to become again. He looked down at the man he was killing, and he saw his own reflection. He released his grip. Cain gasped, sucking in a ragged breath. Elias rose to his feet, swaying, his entire body in agony. He picked up Cain's pistol from the dirt. The fight was over. Cain staggered to his feet, clutching his throat. He looked from Elias's stony face to Ilara's unwavering stance. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a bitter, venomous defeat. "This isn't over," he rasped. "There's nowhere on this earth you can hide." "I'm not hiding anymore," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a final judgment. The violence was done. The night fell silent again, but this was a different silence. It was the silence of survival. The silence of a battle won. The aftermath was a landscape of deep, ringing quiet. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the cool night air, a bitter incense. The two wounded men Cain had brought were groaning in the dirt, their fight extinguished. Silas Cain himself stood hunched over, breathing in ragged gasps, his arrogance shattered, leaving only a pathetic, malevolent core. He glared at Elias, his eyes promising a future of vengeance, but his body betrayed him. He was beaten. Elias did not kill him. He did not tie him up for a law that would never reach this far. He simply pointed with Cain's own pistol toward the road. "Get on your horse. Take them. And if you ever come back, I will not let you go again." The words were a flat, undeniable promise. Cain hesitated for a moment, a flicker of his old defiance in his eyes. He looked at Elias, bleeding from the shoulder but standing unbroken. He looked at Ilara on the porch, a silent, steadfast pillar of strength. He saw that he had not just lost a fight, he had lost to something he could not comprehend. Without another word, he helped his injured men onto their horses and rode away into the darkness from which he came, a defeated king banished from his own bloody history. The hoofbeats faded, and the silence that returned was profound, clean. It was the silence of a fever that had finally broken. Ilara rushed from the porch, her feet making no sound on the packed earth. She did not go to check on the whimpering men or to look at the body of the first attacker. She went straight to Elias. "You're hurt," she breathed, her eyes fixed on the dark, spreading stain on his shirt. The adrenaline that had sustained him began to drain away, and the pain in his shoulder, white-hot and vicious, crashed over him. He swayed, and she was there to steady him, her small frame surprisingly strong. "It's nothing," he lied, the words thick in his mouth. She ignored him, her touch gentle but firm as she guided him toward the house, toward the light spilling from the open doorway. Inside, the world shrank to the small, warm circle of the lamplight. She eased him into a chair at the table, the same table where he had confessed his past. Now, it would be the place where she tended his present. The children, drawn by the sudden quiet, crept up from the root cellar, their eyes wide and fearful. Anna, the eldest, herded them back. "Mama's helping," she whispered, her young voice filled with a woman's understanding. Elara worked with a focused intensity. She cut away the fabric of his shirt with shears, her expression grim as she revealed the raw, bleeding wound. It was a clean shot, through the fleshy part of the shoulder, but it was deep. She cleaned it with water from the kettle, her touch careful, her breath catching every time he flinched. He sat rigid, his jaw clenched, enduring her ministration in the same stoic silence with which he endured everything else. But this was different. Her care was an intimate thing, a language more powerful than any word of comfort. He watched her face, illuminated by the lamp, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the gentleness of her hands. He had been wounded many times in his life, and had always tended to them himself, alone in the dark. This tenderness was a foreign country. When the wound was clean, she bandaged it tightly with strips of clean linen. Her hands lingered on his arm for a moment after she was done. He looked at her, and in her eyes, he saw not pity, but a deep, resonant empathy. The ghosts of the battle, of his past, began to recede, pushed back by the steady, living warmth of her presence. He felt a profound exhaustion settle over him, a weariness that went bone deep. "The law will come," he said, his voice rough. "They'll ask questions about this." He gestured vaguely toward the door, toward the body that still lay in the dirt outside. "We'll tell them what happened," she said simply. That a man came to protect his home, the word hung in the air between them. His home. He looked around the simple room, at the patched walls, the sleeping children in the corner, the woman before him with soot on her cheek and courage in her heart. He had come here as a stranger, a ghost fleeing his own shadow. He had stayed out of a nameless compulsion, a need to guard this small flame of decency in a dark world. He had built a fence to keep the dangers of the world out, but he had only succeeded in walling himself in. He realized he had not been protecting her home. He had been finding his own. "Elara," he started, but he did not know what to say. How to voice the tectonic shift that had occurred within him. She seemed to understand. She did not need the words. She simply placed a hand on his uninjured shoulder. "Rest, Elias," she said softly. "You're safe now." He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, surrendering not to defeat, but to a peace he had never known. The battle was over. The long war inside him, the one that had raged for years across a landscape of guilt and regret, had at last fallen silent. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, washing the blood from the dust, cleansing the land. And inside the small house, under the watchful glow of a single lamp, a new story was beginning, written not in violence, but in healing. The story of a man who had finally come home.